Well, I think for many of us, it was a lot of local things, having to do with the Jim Crow system, all the resentments that were built up over the years, and the way I look at it is that...
I just want to be sure everybody can hear in the back.
The way I would look at it is that we were looking for a vehicle. We were looking for a way of expressing the discontent that many of us felt. And for me, what brought me in was something that I was reminded of this week, because I was in Washington for an event having to do with the King Memorial, the new memorial going up on the Mall. And it, of course, brought back that day in 1963, August 28th. And I must admit that, kind of like Suzanne, I was 19 years old. I had completed 1 year of college. I had no clue about the significance of that event. All I knew is that I wanted to be there. And it was a determination that led me to, it was my first major thing that I didn't tell my parents about, didn't ask their permission. They found out after the fact that I had attended. I managed to get an invitation to the National Student Association meeting in Indiana. I had grown up in New Mexico, so this movement that was going on in the South that was having such an impact on my psyche was thousands of miles away. I couldn't participate, but every day when I read about Martin Luther King, whenever I read about the Little Rock Nine, whenever I read about the students who were sitting in, I knew that this was something that should have an impact on my life. And one thing about growing up in New Mexico is that distances are all relative. So when I looked at Indiana, I knew that was near Washington. And if I could just get to Indiana, I knew I could get to Washington. And sure enough, once I got there, I just started asking people, who's going to the march, and I found a group going, and so therefore I arrived. And I guess when I think about it, my life has been one of unexpectedly trying to explain what I did in 1963 and spending a career doing it. Because I think it's only gradually that I've really understood even the meaning of King's speech. For to me, when you're at an event like that, first of all, you have very little perspective about historical importance. I didn't know that a great speech had been delivered. All I knew is it's the end of a day. Now I have to figure out how I'm going to get home. And only gradually did I begin to understand that something momentous was going on. And I think at every stage, every decade, if I had sat down and written out what was the significance of that, it would be different every single decade. Mm-hmm. And so that now, here in 2008, I see it in a different perspective. And I could describe that I'm going to try to do it very briefly by using just 3 words, 3 phrases. One of them, the Jim Crow system, segregation and discrimination. The other would be colonialism. And the other would be apartheid. And think about what King symbolized in a broader sense. Like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, they have this broad significance. I think in 2008, I would look back and say, and as I've told my students just this week, those things are in the history books now. If you want to learn about the Jim Crow system, you go to the history books to learn about it. If you want to learn about colonialism, yeah, there are a few colonies left that want to be colonies, but you basically go to the history books. If you want to learn about apartheid, you go to the history books. And at that time, I didn't understand that what we were calling the civil rights movement was part of this much broader set of movements that were going on throughout the world that I really think is the greatest freedom struggle the world has ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about at the beginning of the 20th century, most people on the face of the earth did not have basic citizenship rights.
One of the things that's always struck me about Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial was that he was 34. He was 34 years old. He was 39 when he was assassinated. Mm-hmm. And Gloria Steinem was also in her 30s. These two young people changed the world. In 1970, we were in the midst of the Vietnam War, and people were protesting against it, or they were part of the civil rights movement. And then this thing happened called Earth Day, and you were responsible in large measure for it. What were you thinking? Didn't we have enough trouble? Why was it that at that moment in time, with so many other movements already in full phase, do you think that the Earth Day movement and subsequently the environmental movement got started?
You've phrased that question slightly differently than I thought you were going to phrase it, so I'm going to
So change it to whatever you want, like just the way Sarah Palin did.
Sarah Palin, right? Thank God we have now tagged Sarah Palin, returned her to the wild. What was I thinking is difficult. I too will go through a little bit of my youth to wedge into this and think about the answer to the actual question. I grew up in a paper mill town in some of the most beautiful country in the world and saw every day the effects that industry was having, including such things as the enormous amount of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide poured into the atmosphere. We noticed that it was pitting our cars and protested that, and the mill erected a shower so you could wash your car at the end of your shift. But it didn't really occur to us that it was doing something to our lungs as well. In fact, I've had a persistent lifelong lung problem that, at least in my heart, I'm convinced came out of that. Every now and then, it would just have some huge wave of stuff that would pass through the system, and everything in the river for 4 or 5 miles downstream would be dead. And it just seemed that it should be possible to have a comfortable, modern, prosperous society without those sorts of impacts. My junior year, I was lucky enough to get a grant from the National Science Foundation. This is junior year in high school, to go to an ecology seminar. I had no clue what the word meant. And nor did anybody else. We all just saw it as a chance to get out of our towns and away from our parents, and we went off and chased girls for a summer. But learned the basic principles of ecology and how they governed the interactions of all life on the planet. Then I got to a point where I was sort of facing the question that you were facing. It's the typical 19-year-old's wonder of, what is the purpose of it all? I couldn't find much. I took that teenage Weltschmerz out to the limits. I was acutely aware of the war in Southeast Asia, though at that point it was still not fully escalated, but clearly heading the wrong direction. And I was confident my country was on the wrong side, and ultimately I believe my country was the wrong side, seeking to get allies with us, but rather than allying ourselves with one of the protagonists there. Deeply involved with, concerned by the civil rights movement and the systematic way that one portion of the country was oppressing another portion of it. It was my portion that was oppressing another portion. Aware of the nuclear missiles aimed at one another, aware of the growing stockpiles of chemical, biological weapons, and really concerned about America, and absolutely impotent. No sense at all that I could have any hope of making an impact on anything.